Okay, with this, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Elmi Muller. She is a transplant surgeon and head of the transplant unit at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you very much, Dr. Muller.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. So today I'm going to try and give you an overview of what we as clinicians mean when we talk about organ trafficking. And in my career I've been a transplant surgeon, but I've also been the chair of the Declaration of Istanbul. And this group of people are clinicians who work specifically on the issue of educating people around organ trafficking. So I'm going to, we'll ask that the translation happens simultaneously. So today I'm going to take you through 5 different issues which I think are important for this audience to know about. How we define organ trafficking, what are the requirements to set up an organ trafficking ring, what drives this process. I'm going to specifically give you a little bit of data on Africa, and I'll end up with a few things that I think could potentially be done. So how do we define organ trafficking? Many people in this audience probably read the media, and your idea of what organ trafficking is very much framed by what you see in the media. However, in the Declaration of Istanbul group and as clinicians, we try to be very specific. And this slide probably addressed the question that Jennifer had, how often do we see organ trafficking? The problem is, of course, that we don't have good data. And organ trafficking is something that isn't reported. So we don't have a database where people can go and they can report, oh, we've seen a victim of organ trafficking. So many of the numbers are estimations. And the last big group that looked into this in 2007 estimated that about 6,000 of kidneys per year is taking place from organ trafficked victims. But we also know from more recent data that many transplants come from donors who travel for their transplant. And this is for us certainly an issue if we see a patient who comes back after a transplant from a donor and they traveled. And why is that? Because many people travel when they can't get a transplant in their own home country. And then it's very, very important also to understand the definitions. So we updated the definitions for organ trafficking in 2018. And I've just highlighted there the one I want you to look at for today. Without removing an organ from a living or deceased donor without consent, and with potentially a financial gain to the person who donated the organ. This is probably the most common definition that we use for organ trafficking. But also remember that there's another definition we need to understand, and that's the definition of transplant tourism. So this is where people are traveling and they're moving around between different countries in order to obtain an organ because it's not available in their own home country, or the country that they come from doesn't have the ability to provide an organ. And very often this is the case for people from African descent, where transplantation is simply not available in their home countries. So if we would have to now think about which ones of these patients who transplant are at risk for being part of an organ trafficking ring, we need to understand a little bit more about what these rings entail. And basically I'm going to take you through 4 steps for an organ trafficking ring. We're going to start off with the socioeconomic factors that drive organ trafficking. And Nancy already alluded to this, and this is data that comes from Pakistan that was published by Dr. Naqvi et al. And they showed that 90% of patients who come from a place where they have been exploited are people who live in very low socioeconomic circumstances. So if you look at that chart at the top, you will see the lower the income of the country that the potential donor came from, the higher the risk that this patient received an organ from an organ trafficking victim. The second thing I would like to highlight are the educational factors for people who get organ trafficked organ. So somebody who are going to go and buy a kidney often doesn't have the information available to understand exactly what he or she is in for. And often people who go and sell a kidney or are part of this ring are people who are not very well informed about the risks. So for people who supply a kidney or sell a kidney, they need to understand a few risk factors, and this is what we find often are missing when we see patients who've been part of these rings. The first thing is, of course, that there's a short-term legal risk. In many countries, the potential donor can be prosecuted. There are often false documentation, money laundering, and one of the biggest problems, of course, when you start thinking about prosecution of these people is what do you actually, on what legal basis do you prosecute them? So the first thing that people don't realize when they go and sell a kidney is that they actually are taking part in things like money laundering and falsified documents, which puts them at a legal risk when they return to their own home countries. Then there's the short-term medical risk. The short-term medical risk usually are infections, immediate post-operative wound problems, and those things, when we look at people who've become organ donors in a trafficking ring, they often return back to their home country or to their homes with serious infections and serious disadvantages in terms of their medical risk in the short term. But probably the biggest thing that they have, and what we as clinicians are very concerned about, is their long-term medical risk. Because these people return to countries where they will have no follow-up, where they will have no access to dialysis, and if they run into trouble after one of their kidneys have been removed, they just have nowhere to go to. So if you look at the data, let's go one back. We know when we talk to people who want to donate a kidney in normal circumstances that we have to give them a lot of information about their post-donation risk. And we also know that this risk is very variable in terms of where their background medical health status is. So people who have hypertension or diabetes or some other medical risk factors will be at higher risk to develop long-term kidney problems. Of course, with trafficked victims, that risk is not usually explained. And it's usually very young people who go into this. So you get 18 or 19-year-old people who want to provide to their families, and they go into this procedure thinking that they're going to donate a kidney and they're going to be absolutely fine. But this risk is probably never explained to them in great detail. Then the third thing I just quickly want to mention, and that is that you cannot have organ trafficking if you don't have a medical infrastructure. And that is why we in Africa are now becoming much more aware of our risk as a country to be targeted by organ trafficking rings, because the moment you have a hospital infrastructure, you've got professional people who can operate and who can do a transplant, and you've got the laboratory facilities, you probably are a potential target for these trafficking rings. And in many countries, like we see in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana, we're seeing a lot of new private hospital groups setting up. And this is the worry that there's not good oversight and that these facilities are available now to potential trafficking rings. So that brings me to the issue of oversight. And of course, if you don't have good oversight, then you probably might have this going on in your country and you won't even know. Because let's face it, we can't all monitor what's happening in each hospital. And I've just there starred some of the African countries that have got some oversight over hospitals and private healthcare facilities specifically. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is that we don't have data and that we don't know exactly what's going on. But this is an important risk factor to become part of an organ trafficking ring. What drives these organ trafficking. Nancy spoke about this very eloquently, and I'm not going to say much about it, but if you look at that slide, the light blue part is the European data of people on the waiting list. The red boxes are the people who receive living donor transplants, and the blue boxes are those who receive deceased donor transplants. So you can see what drives it. Many, many people who are on dialysis, and of course we in Africa and in the developing countries are potentially the more poor countries on the left side who will supply the donors, and on the right side you're seeing the countries who will be benefiting from these donors. And this is the type of flow that we're seeing for donors to recipients in the world. Now, is there organ trafficking in Africa? I was asked to talk about this, and it's a very difficult thing to talk about because we don't have good data to go by. But I'm going to show you a real case example of what's happened in Africa and South Africa. And this is something that I think is possible in almost every African country now. So Netcare is a private hospital group in South Africa, and they were approached by organ trafficking ring who asked them whether they could supply transplantation services to people who travel to South Africa and receive a transplant. And what they basically had, they had Israeli brokers who'd identified recipients from Israel, but also from European countries, rich countries. And then the same broker identified donors from a different place. So in this case, it was from Brazil. And the third thing that happened then was the hospital group in South Africa and the medical doctors in South Africa were providing the transplant service. The doctors in South Africa said that they didn't realize that these patients were unrelated and part of a trafficking ring. According to the paperwork, everybody was shown as nephews or nieces, and the doctors said that they were not guilty. Of course, they did have some idea that there are some problems here. But 179 transplants took place in this organ trafficking ring in South Africa before this was officially stopped. And what happened in South Africa was that because of this, we had some legislative changes. We appointed some ethics committees specifically supporting the government in looking at unrelated transplantation in South Africa, and a lot of professional guidelines were introduced in the country to stop this. This is one of the things we work on in the Declaration of Istanbul Group now, to try and educate professional people about organ trafficking and trying to get their buy-in to not be part of these rings. So what can we do? The Istanbul Summit in 2008 was started to educate professionals, legals, lawyers, everybody about these situations and to give people documentation. We've now moved on. We've updated the document. We now know that there are much more new definitions available, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have responsibility, especially as talking here as a medical profession, to educate our medical people. And this is just data that we did in a survey last year. You can see those highlighted yellow numbers. These are the people in Australia and in developed countries, the doctors who report that they have either looked at a patient who received an organ from an organ trafficked victim, counseled a patient who wanted to travel for a transplant where the donor was unknown to them, and had been involved in some or other way with an ethical problem related to organ trafficking. And you can see those are quite high percentages. So we have now updated this document to make it more streamlined, to give doctors more support in terms of how they should look at organ trafficking victims. We have updated the new issues, the new definitions, and it's a constant work for us to update health professionals around these issues. But there also needs to be teamwork between medical professionals, legal experts, governments, and you can't fight this thing in isolation. So it's very important for us to reach out to the legal community to make sure that they also understand how we are addressing these issues, and then of course for us to get legal perspectives in our own professional meetings, and to make sure that people are fully aware of what these issues are. So thank you very much for the talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muller.